My name is Daniel. For 20 years, my life was built on a foundation of quiet, predictable love. My wife, Clara, was the architect of that peace. She was a librarian, a woman whose voice was a soft murmur and whose presence was as calming as the scent of old books and fresh coffee that filled our home. We met in college, two quiet souls who found a universe in each other's silence. Our life wasn't filled with grand adventures, but with small, precious rituals. Saturday morning farmers markets, reading on the porch swing, her hand always finding mine in the dark. The first crack in that foundation appeared on a Tuesday. It was Clara's turn to do the grocery shopping. I was working from my home office, a sanctuary of organized chaos, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. "Forgot the list. Can you check the kitchen drawer? It's the blue notepad." I found the notepad, a small, leather-bound thing she'd had for years. As I picked it up, a single, folded piece of newspaper fluttered out and drifted to the floor like a dead leaf. I unfolded it. It was a clipping from the obituary section of a small-town newspaper I'd never heard of, the Oak Ridge Gazette. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and the name at the top, printed in stark black letters, made the blood drain from my face. It was Clara's name. Clara Marie Evans. My Clara. My eyes scanned the text, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. Clara Marie Evans, 24, of Oak Ridge, passed away tragically on June 18th. The date was 20 years ago, the year before we met. The obituary mentioned she was survived by her parents, Robert and Eleanor Evans. It was a standard, brief notice of a life cut short, but the woman it was written about was sleeping in my bed, breathing my air, sharing my life. A cold, numbing disbelief washed over me. This had to be a mistake, a different Clara Evans, a macabre coincidence. But the date of birth was hers. The middle name was hers. I stood there in the silent kitchen, the paper trembling in my hand, the world I knew tilting on its axis. Who was the woman I had been living with for 2 decades? I carefully refolded the clipping, placed it back in the notepad, and put the notepad back in the drawer. My hands were ice cold. I said nothing when Clara returned, her arms laden with grocery bags, her smile as gentle as ever. But for the first time in 20 years, I looked at that smile and saw a stranger. The obituary became a ghost that haunted our home. It stood between us at dinner, a silent, invisible guest. It watched us as we watched television in the evening. I started studying Clara with the intensity of a detective on a cold case. I looked for cracks in her story, for hints of a past she had never shared. She never talked about her life before college. She had told me her parents died in a car accident when she was in her late teens, that she had no other family. It was a story I had accepted without question, a tragedy that explained her quiet solitude. Now it felt like the cornerstone of an elaborate lie. I began a secret investigation. I started with the obvious, the town of Oak Ridge. A quick search showed it was a small rural community about 4 hours away. I dug deeper, searching for records of Robert and Eleanor Evans. I found an old property record. Then, using a people search website I was ashamed to use, I found them. Or at least I found an Eleanor Evans, now in her late 70s, living in a retirement community just 2 towns over from Oak Ridge. She was alive. The mother of my deceased wife was alive and living less than 5 hours away. The revelation was a physical blow. Every story Clara had ever told me about being an orphan, about having no one, was a fabrication. The gentle, loving woman I knew was a carefully constructed fiction. I felt a profound sense of violation, as if the last 20 years of my life had been a play, and I was the only actor who didn't know he was on a stage. I couldn't confront her yet. I needed to know more. I needed to understand why. I told Clara I had a 2-day business trip, a client meeting out of town. I packed a bag, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. I wasn't going to a meeting. I was driving to Oak Ridge. The drive to Oak Ridge felt like crossing into another dimension. The city's sprawl gradually gave way to rolling hills and dense pine forests. The town itself was a postcard of quiet Americana, a single main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a small post office. My first stop was the local library, a small brick building that smelled exactly like Clara of paper and dust and time. I found the archives for the Oak Ridge Gazette on microfilm. My hands were slick with sweat as I scrolled to the date a few days after the alleged death. I was looking for more. A news story about the tragic accident. I found it on page 5. A short article headlined, "Local Woman Missing, Presumed Dead." The article stated that Clara Marie Evans had disappeared after a picnic by the river. Her belongings, a purse, a sweater, had been found on the riverbank. The current was strong that spring, and after a 3-day search yielded no body, the authorities presumed she had drowned. The article included a quote from her grieving parents, Robert and Eleanor, pleading for any information. There was no body. She hadn't died. She had vanished. She had run away. And she had let her parents and the entire world believe she was dead. My next stop was the Pinecrest Meadows retirement community. I felt like an intruder, a grave robber digging up a past that was never meant to be found. I asked for Eleanor Evans at the front desk. The nurse directed me to a sunroom at the back of the building, and there she was. A frail woman with a shock of white hair, sitting in a wheelchair by a large window, a knitted blanket over her legs. She had Clara's eyes, the same gentle shape, the same shade of hazel. When I approached, those eyes looked up at me, not with suspicion, but with a quiet curiosity. "Mrs. Evans," I said, my voice unsteady. "My name is Daniel. I think I know your daughter." The change in her was instantaneous. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on the blanket, began to tremble. Her eyes filled with a pain so deep and ancient, it seemed to suck the air from the room. "Clara," she whispered, the name a fragile, broken thing. "You've seen my Clara. Is she alive?" And in that moment, any lingering anger I felt towards Clara was eclipsed by a devastating wave of pity for this old woman. For 20 years, she had lived with the torment of not knowing, mourning a daughter who had chosen to erase her. I sat down beside her, my own composure crumbling. "She's alive," I said softly. "She's alive, and she's my wife." The story Eleanor told me over the next hour, between quiet sobs, was not one of a happy family. She spoke of Robert, Clara's father, not as a grieving parent from the newspaper article, but as a stern, deeply religious man, a controlling figure who had mapped out Clara's life with an iron will. Clara had been engaged to a man from their church, a match Robert had arranged. She had never loved him. The picnic by the river was the day before the wedding. It wasn't an accident. It was an escape, a desperate final act of a young woman who saw no other way out. She had staged her own death to flee a life that felt like a prison sentence. "She left a note," Eleanor whispered, pulling a worn yellowed piece of paper from a small pocket in her dress. It was creased from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. "She left it for me, told me she was sorry, but she couldn't do it. She begged me not to look for her." She handed it to me. The handwriting was unmistakably Clara's. It ended with, "Please let me be dead to you. It's the only way I can be free." I drove home in a daze, the note burning a hole in my pocket. The pieces had fallen into place, but the picture they formed was more tragic than I could have imagined. My wife wasn't a con artist or a criminal. She was a fugitive, a ghost who had been running from a life of oppression for 2 decades, so terrified of being found that she built her new life on a foundation of complete isolation. She chose a man like me, quiet, stable, unconnected to her past, because I was safe. I was the perfect hiding place. When I walked through the front door, Clara was on the porch swing, reading. She looked up, her gentle smile fading the moment she saw my face. I didn't say a word. I simply walked over, sat beside her, and placed the old yellowed obituary clipping and her handwritten note on the bench between us. The color drained from her face. She looked from the papers to my eyes, and the wall she had built so carefully over 20 years crumbled in an instant. A single silent tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. She didn't try to explain or deny it. The truth was finally here, sitting between us on the worn wooden swing. "She's alive, Clara," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Your mother. She's alive, and she has spent every day of the last 20 years mourning you." Clara broke then. The quiet, controlled woman I knew dissolved into heart-wrenching, body-shaking sobs. It was the sound of 2 decades of fear and guilt finally breaking free. I didn't hold her, not yet. I just let her cry. Let the storm of her past wash over her. We sat there as the sun set, the ghost of the young woman she had been finally stepping out of the shadows. The problem was no longer the lie. The problem was the truth and the daunting, painful, and uncertain path of building a new, honest life from the ruins of the old one. We had to decide if the woman who faked her death could finally find the courage to start living again. The silence that followed was the heaviest I had ever known. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical presence in the room, thick with the dust of 20 years of lies and the sharp, clean pain of truth. Clara's sobs had subsided into silent, shuddering breaths. She stared at the obituary and the note as if they were artifacts from a ghost, her own ghost. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, the words cracked and broken. "Daniel, I am so sorry." "It's not about the apology, Clara," I said, my own voice sounding distant and tired. "It's about everything. Who are you?" It was the simplest, most devastating question I could ask. The woman I knew was a carefully crafted sculpture. Now I was seeing the raw, unshaped clay beneath, and I had no idea what it was supposed to be. She took a deep, ragged breath, her eyes fixed on her hands clenched in her lap. "My name is Clara Marie Evans. That part is true. The rest was a survival suit. I put it on to navigate a world that felt like it was trying to crush me." She began to talk, the words spilling out in a slow, painful trickle that soon became a river. She described her father Robert, not with anger, but with a deep residual fear. His love was conditional, based on obedience and adherence to a strict, unforgiving path. The engagement to Matthew, a deacon's son in their church, was the final brick in a wall she felt was closing in on her. "He was a good man in my father's eyes," she said, "but to me, he was just an extension of my father's will, smiling, polite, and utterly devoid of any warmth I craved. The wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a sentencing. The plan," she explained, "was not born of cunning, but of pure animal desperation." She had saved a little money from a secret part-time job. The picnic by the river was a common occurrence. No one would suspect. She left her purse, her sweater, a single shoe on the muddy bank. She wrote the note to her mother, the most painful thing she had ever done, begging for her understanding and her silence. Then she walked away. She hitched a ride with a long-haul trucker, using the cash to buy a bus ticket as far as it would take her, which happened to be the city where we eventually met. "For the first year, I jumped at every shadow," she confessed, her voice a hollow echo. "I worked under the table jobs, paid for everything in cash. I was sure that any day my father would find me and drag me back. When I saw my own obituary in a newspaper from a neighboring town I passed through, I felt nothing. It was like reading about a stranger. That Clara was dead. I had to believe she was dead to keep going." She told me how she painstakingly built her new identity. She enrolled in community college using her real name but fabricated high school transcripts. She created a past as an orphan, knowing it was the only way to avoid questions about family, about holidays, about her life before. "When I met you," she said, looking at me for the first time since her confession, her eyes brimming with a fresh wave of tears, "it was the first time I felt safe. You were so solid, so real. Your world was quiet and kind. Telling you the truth would have meant risking the only good thing I had ever built. I was a coward. I know that now." I listened, my mind reeling. The narrative of my life was being rewritten in real time. Our first date, the day I proposed, our wedding day. All of these milestones were now tinted with the dark, hidden context of her flight. I had fallen in love with a mirage, but the feelings, the 20 years of shared life, they were real. They were the most real thing I had. "And your mother?" I asked gently. A fresh wave of grief contorted her features. I thought it would be easier for her. If I was dead, she could mourn me and move on. If I had just run away, it would have been a scandal. My father would have hunted me. He would have seen it as a personal rebellion against God and himself. This way, she was blameless. She was a grieving mother, not the mother of a wayward daughter. She buried her face in her hands. I was 24. I was selfish and scared. I thought I was protecting her, but I was wrong. I see that now. I condemned her to a different kind of prison. We sat in the growing darkness for a long time. The initial shock was receding, leaving behind a complicated landscape of betrayal, empathy, and a love that felt both wounded and resilient. What now, Daniel? Clara's voice was small, like a child's. What do we do now? I looked at my wife. Not the librarian, not the orphan, not the carefully constructed persona. I looked at Clara Marie Evans, the fugitive, the survivor, the woman who had carried this unbearable weight alone for half her life. The anger was still there, a cold, hard stone in my gut, but it was now surrounded by something else, a profound, aching sorrow for the girl she had been, and a fierce, protective instinct for the woman she was. I don't know, I answered honestly. It was the only truth I could offer. But we find out, together. The first step was the most daunting. A few days later, with Clara's hand trembling violently in mine, she dialed the number for Pinecrest Meadows. She asked for Eleanor Evans. When her mother's frail, hopeful voice came on the line, Clara could barely speak. "Mom," she choked out, It's Clara." The sound that came from the other end of the line was not one of anger or recrimination. It was a raw, keening wail of pure, unadulterated relief, followed by a torrent of weeping so intense we could hardly understand the words. My baby, my Clara, I knew. In my heart, I never stopped hoping. They talked for an hour, Clara crying, her mother crying, the years of silence dissolving in a storm of shared grief and love. We made plans to visit. It was terrifying. It was the ghost returning to the land of the living. The drive to Pinecrest Meadows was even longer than the first time. Clara was silent, her face pale, staring out the window at the familiar landscape of her past. When we walked into the sunroom, Eleanor was waiting, her eyes fixed on the door. The moment she saw Clara, she let out a small, broken cry and stretched out her arms. Clara ran to her. She fell to her knees by the wheelchair and buried her face in her mother's blanket, sobbing, repeating, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, over and over. Her mother just held her, stroking her hair, whispering, You're home. You're finally home. I stood back, a witness to a miracle I hadn't known I was part of. I watched as my wife, for the first time in 20 years, stopped being a ghost. The road ahead would be long. There would be difficult conversations, moments of anger and resentment from me, and a lifetime of guilt for Clara to process. There was also the shadow of her father, who had passed away 5 years earlier, never knowing the truth. Their reconciliation would forever be incomplete. But in that sun-drenched room, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life nearing its end and another beginning anew, I understood. The obituary I found wasn't a document of death. It was a map that led us through a wilderness of lies and fear, not to an end, but to a much more difficult, messy, and authentic beginning. Our story was no longer just a quiet tale of two souls. It was a story of resurrection. Returning home after meeting her mother was like stepping onto a new, unfamiliar planet. The walls of our house, which had always been a symbol of safety, now felt thin and fragile. We were no longer just Daniel and Clara, the quiet, happy couple. We were now Daniel, Clara, Eleanor, Robert, in the ghost of a 20-year lie. The first few weeks were the hardest. We tiptoed around each other as if navigating a minefield. Sometimes I would catch Clara looking at me, her eyes filled with such fear and guilt that it made me want to scream. My own emotions were a turbulent sea swelling with waves of anger at the deception, then receding into a deep, aching pity for the terrified young woman she had been. The simple rituals that once defined our life now felt like complex performances. Saturday morning coffee was consumed in a heavy silence. The books we used to read side by side remained closed. The space between us in our bed felt like a chasm. I was mourning the woman I thought I married, while simultaneously trying to get to know the stranger sleeping next to me. The breakthrough, as it often does, came from an unexpected place. A letter arrived, addressed to Clara in a shaky, elegant script. It was from Eleanor. Clara held it for a full day, too afraid to open it. When she finally did, she read it in the porch swing, her body trembling. After a long time, she handed it to me without a word. "My dearest Clara," it began, "seeing you was like waking from a 20-year nightmare. I want you to know with all that I am, that I forgive you. I understand the fear that drove you. Your father, his love was a strict and demanding thing. I was too weak to stand up to him, to protect you. I carry that regret every day. Please, do not carry the weight of my grief any longer. Your return has given me a peace I thought I would never find. Let us use the time we have left to build new memories, however small. All my love, Mother." I looked at Clara. The letter hadn't erased the pain, but it had thrown her a lifeline. It was permission to stop punishing herself. "It doesn't fix everything," she whispered, her voice raw. "No," I agreed, folding the letter carefully. "But it's a start." We started talking then, truly talking, not about the logistics of the lie, but about the feelings behind it. She told me about the constant, low-grade terror of her first years in the city. I confessed my own feelings of betrayal, my fear that our entire marriage was a sham. We didn't have the answers, but for the first time, we were asking the questions together. We began driving to Pinecrest every other weekend. The visits were emotionally exhausting, but healing. I watched Clara slowly relearn how to be a daughter. She would brush her mother's hair, read to her, and they would look at old photo albums pictures of a childhood Clara had pretended never happened. I saw the joy in Eleanor's eyes, a light that had been extinguished for 2 decades, now rekindled. One afternoon as we were leaving, Clara turned to me in the parking lot. The setting sun cast a golden glow on her face, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the old peace in her eyes. But it was deeper now, earned rather than manufactured. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, taking my hand, "for not giving up on me, for coming with me on this journey back." I squeezed her hand. "Where else would I be? The road ahead is still long. The ghost of Robert Evans and his oppressive faith still lingers. Clara is in therapy, finally unpacking a lifetime of trauma. I have my own sessions, learning to rebuild trust. Some days are a struggle, but the foundation of our life is no longer the quiet, predictable peace of before. It is something stronger, more resilient. It is a foundation built on the hard, unshakable ground of truth, forgiveness, and a love that was tested in the fire of a terrible secret and chose to endure. We are no longer a man and a ghost. We are 2 survivors building a new life from the pieces of the old, one honest day at a time."